Welcome, everyone. You can see how many voices we need to have here to talk about perspectives on linkage involving Indigenous data. There's so many more voices, and there's other actually sessions happening at the same time that conflicted with this session that would have been great to have more people up here. But I'm just really want to introduce and welcome these esteemed guests, although we're guests in many ways, to share with us their experience about linkage involving data, and also about the way that they practically apply the principles we talked about yesterday in the morning session in this room. It's one of the things that was really important message from yesterday was the diversity in the way that principles evolve and also the way that they're applied. So I think this is a really exciting opportunity for us to hear from different people who are working in different ways. So I wanted to just briefly introduce the people who are sitting here, and they will have a chance to introduce themselves, and just so the structure of what we're going to do is just each person is or each group is going to take 5 minutes to just introduce themselves and to answer that question at the bottom there, just to describe what they're doing and what does Indigenous-led data linkage look like in your region and why it's important. And then we have agreed on a series of follow-up questions that I'll ask of the panel, and then we'll have time for everyone to ask questions of the panel as well. So it'll be a little bit structured, but hopefully it's a chance to engage and discuss rather than a series of presentations. So with that, I think actually I'll just leave you to introduce yourselves so that you can say what you want to say to people. And we'll go in the order, doesn't matter how you're sitting, we'll go in this order to help with the slides, the slide order. Yeah, go ahead.
So just introduce myself.
Introduce yourself.
Oh, okay.
And then you guys have some slides, right? So
Okay.
you can bring up the Healy slides.
Okay. My name is William Wadsworth. As you can see, that's a really English name, but that's not my real name. My name's Iskadorka. I'm from the Blood Tribe. Anneme Amskapuchs, Southern Alberta. Anneme Tidop Ispinan. Amskapuchs Anneme Genesk Sachkoi. Hokinistugo Kanista Iskadorka. Sugapiki Dotochsua. Ahmad Sachkoi. It's called me Stuck East, this mountains. They're called me Stuck East, and we're from the Blackfoots. And as you know, Blackfoots kind of roamed Edmonton all the way down into towards the Yellowstone River and that area. So we kind of know the names of all the places here. So right here is Hanime. This place is called me Stuck East. So just to share a little bit about the names here. Iskadorka means chasing back horses back to the camp. That's what my name is.
Oki, Hidamik Skanatani, Nisto Anako Kaboyaki. That's my Blackfoot name. I carry my grandmother's name. I want to welcome you all here to our traditional territories, the Blackfoots, and happy to have our panel members here. And I'm Bonnie Healy. I'm the Executive Director for the Alberta First Nations Information Governance Centre. I'm also the current chair of the Board of Directors for the National Centre, FNIGC.
Okay, my Blackfoot name is Anna Tsietsinski, and I'm Chyloe Healy. I am one of the research assistants and data analysts also with the Alberta First Nation Information Governance Centre. And welcome to the Blackfoot territory. I'm also from Kainai.
Thank you for that welcome. Skuktash, Lemchuk-Favel, Andrew Martinez. I am a research specialist with the Native Nations Institute at the University of Arizona in the USA. I am Donna, Deganyo, and Yaqui, all from the southwest region of the U.S. I'm excited to be here, and this land is beautiful. My first time here, and it's been quite an experience with the snow as well. And Blackfoot has some amazing territories in which they occupy. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Good morning, Laurel. Lemchuk-Favel is my name. I'm the director of Health Economics and Analytics at the First Nations Health Authority in BC. So happy to be here. I'm a prairie girl by heart. I'm transmuted over to beautiful BC, and happy to be here surrounded by these very energetic and beautiful mountains.
Ani, Misko Nug, Kwe, Kiriganzibi and Dujba. Good morning, I'm Carmen Jones. My Anishinaabe name is Red Star Woman. I come raised in the Garden River Reserve just outside Sault Ste. Marie, and my band is Serpent River. We travel along the North Shore. I am the research manager and data person at the Chiefs of Ontario. I work very closely with the Institute for Clinical Evaluative Sciences. And I want to acknowledge the grandfathers, the mountains, and thank the Blackfoot people for having this meeting on their land. Miigwech.
Kia ora, ko Donna Cormack ahau. I'm Donna, I'm from Aotearoa, New Zealand. My tribal affiliations are to Ngaitahu Ngāti Mamoi, the tribes in the South Island of New Zealand. And I also want to acknowledge and thank the Blackfoot Nation for allowing me some space and time to sit and think around these issues of data sovereignty with other Indigenous peoples. I'm a researcher, health researcher and teacher in 2 Indigenous health research centres based in universities in Aotearoa. Ngā mihi.
Thank you. So can we have the Healy presentation now? Yeah. If you want to speak from here, you can. Either way. Probably most comfortable just to speak. Yeah, I'll just sit.
So I just want to maybe take a opportunity to just share some of the things that we're doing here in Alberta. We have been having a relationship building with the province of Alberta, with the Ministry of Alberta Health, and really trying to establish a data linkage population identifier for First Nations in the surveillance unit of Alberta Health. So I'll just quickly go over our partnership. Next slide, please.
Oh, sorry, I can do that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, just to explain our organization, we're relatively young. We've been incorporated since 2010, but fully operational since 2011. We're mandated by the Chiefs of Alberta to implement all things data collection and research initiatives through mandating implementation and respect of OCAP. So that's the ownership, control, access, and possession of information. We're governed by a board of directors and a chief senate that are appointed by the 3 treaty areas. So in Alberta, we have Treaty 7 to the south, Treaty 6 is central, and Treaty 8 to the north. We have roughly 47 nations. All 47 nations own this organization through their leadership. Next slide. And this is just an example of our governance structure. Next. And I think in order to really understand how we build relationships and how we've counted ourselves historically, I just want Billy to kind of explain that first.
Okay, I think we have a slide of the, what you call it? Okay. Green, I guess. Okay, so this right here is what's called a winter count. I don't know if some of you have seen this before. In our language, we call it itapansi, and it starts off from the middle, and it accounts significant happenings that have happened during the year, like the most important things external that happen to the Blackfoots collectively. It starts in the middle, and then it tells a story. You can't really see it in this picture, but what it does is moves in a counterclockwise circle, and it ends at on the outside, so it just spirals out. So the center, and it writes about it. It accounts events that happened during the year. So one winter count could be 100 years old, maybe, because this one significant thing that happened to the Blackfoots, and everything. Story-wise goes in a circle, so everything is connected. Time-wise, I guess from a linear sense, you could see that those would be the years, but in our significance, from our perspective of the Blackfoots, it's the happening that is more important. That's recorded. So each event would tell a story and a long story. And you'd have people, I guess you would call them orators in Western society, where they would be able to account these stories. And the stories would be duplicated amongst the clans and the tribes amongst the people so that each one could know the story of that history of that winter count. They also have winter counts that account for an individual's life story. And those would be on a smaller scale and would be very detailed because the Blackfoots like to count coup, and so they like to tell their stories. So they're really about war and some of the good deeds that they've done. They've brought goods back to the camp from external tribes. So itabansi. So I guess what I'm trying to get to here is that that oral history and is the most important, stories and songs. And that is the way that we record our history, and that is the way we record our information onto people. And our stories are right out. Just got to look outside here, and you'll begin the access to the trees, to the mountains, the songs. There's mountains here. Just have songs. I'm a singer, so I could even sing you the mountain song if I had time. But I have 40 seconds. It looks like. This would talk about, it was told from 1764, dated back on one of the winter counts by a man named Sachkumapi, who talked about the death camps, they would call them. Ganaxi, that's everybody died from smallpox. In 1764, that was already happening. Some of the stories we hear was that in the Blackfoot way of passing, they would tie in scaffolds, tie the bodies up so that they're closer to Creator, and so the spirit then moves on faster. These deaths happen so fast that sometimes they could only do that within the teepee themselves, and they'd hang the bodies in the rafters. But they'd get sick themselves handling those bodies. So it was like whole camps would have to be sewn shut. It was so bad that they began to sew the doors shut of the teepee, and they would know that this camp is all gone, you know. And so these things are recorded in the history on the winter count. And so here's some other noticeable things. I guess you could see in 1780. Anybody want to take a guess what that would be? TB. It's the cough, tuberculosis. There's a story to that 1837 one. We can just move on. So you could see that you could tie or you could connect significant dates to significant happenings on the winter count themselves. This particular one goes back 1764, 1780, 1837, 1864, 1868, and so on. I wish I could tell you about all these symbols, but that's not my specialty. In Blackfoot society, you have kind of like a specialty. Mine is singing. So it was just drilled into me since young, learning the songs of the different societies, clans, ceremonies. I'm a member of the Brave Dog Society, which is the Ganatsumita. In each society, there's bundles as well, and there's ways of recording things, but I can't share these with you because they're sacred knowledge. Eh? Other sources of data, I guess you could see. Have you ever heard of what's it called again? Southern Alberta, what's it called again? Writing on Stone. Mm-hmm. Writing on Stone. Those have account of history there on Writing on Stone. I guess there would be the story of that symbol. I think we could give copies of these later, I'm not sure. But sorry, I only had 5 minutes.
It's hard to do a history lesson in 5 minutes, so I appreciate that, Billy. And really quickly, just about the data of availability in Alberta. So we have a collection of administrative data that we work with the Ministry of Alberta Health and their team. One of the researchers or the epidemiologists that we work with and have been building relationships with for many years now. I think I've known her for about 6 years, and we've worked together collaboratively on international work as well. And I regret that she's not able to join us here to really reflect the partnership, but she's defending her thesis today, so I'm hoping to get a good news phone call at noon. Her name's Amy Calhoun. And so Alberta historically had data available that had identifiers when we paid into health premiums. And so the federal government would transfer an identifier like list to Alberta Health so that they could track who was eligible for payment. And this happened from about 2000. We have Larry Svensson in the room, so if you have any questions particularly to that, he would be the one to be asking those questions to. And it went on till about 2009 when we stopped paying premiums, and Alberta Health no longer has a health premium. We were then mandated by the chiefs of Alberta to really develop a relationship and a governance agreement to apply for the Indian registry to use it as a population identifier within the ministry to replace those health premium identifiers. But currently, right now, we're hostage to things like postal codes, and not every nation has a unique postal code directly to them. So we can do a couple of things. We can provide them a health status report on their nation utilizing postal codes, or the nation itself will enter into a data sharing agreement and transfer an identifier list to the province so that they can get a really clean understanding of what's going on in their nation. So we've worked with a number of nations within the province of Alberta, I think almost half of them, to get them back their surveillance data through this process. So we are in the midst of trying to finalize this relationship. We've applied for the Indian registry successfully with the Indian and Northern Affairs Canada. We will be presenting the new way forward with the Memorandum of Understanding that we just developed with the chiefs of Alberta next week. And then we're entering into a nation-to-nation relationship, like I described, where nations will sign a data sharing agreement with the ministry and really provide either the list that they have or agree to utilize the list that through the Indian registry to be able to identify them and get them back their data. So Chyloe's just going to talk a little bit about how we're doing that process with nations.
So we're doing a lot of work with the community profiles and helping communities populate them. So community profiles are made up of the indicators which identify the characteristics of the community. And through this process, we're really able to identify where communities are successful and where they can plan to do interventions for wellness. So it's really used in a positive way to assist for creating better conditions. So you have to go back. So the first step is really relationship building, and this is done through the organization, through external sources with the communities. It's really to make sure we have OCAP relationships, ethical spaces created, so it's a trusting relationship. And we're really just the community resource to help them navigate these relationship building. The next part is the community sessions. And this is really ongoing because we do it so much with communities because we want them in every aspect of the decision making. So once we've established a relationship, our organization will work together in a series of community sessions. And we never prescribe solutions as an organization. It's the communities that really pick what they're going to prioritize because they know their information and knowledge and how to best use it. So the focus is just really identifying the language of use for both sides so they understand their data sources and how their data sources are presented, as well as the needs that they want to express. So we work with community members to kind of focus on priorities for what they want to focus on, like, for example, mental wellness. And we work with technicians, elders, and staff to identify these priorities. And then with that, we really get them to identify indicators and to identify indicators in their own language. So not just the deficit indicators that a lot of Western institutions are measuring, like mortality and everything. And that's when I begin to map the data with the data sources and the indicators that they would like. So that's when they have the data transfer. So they go to the existing data sources that they have. So let's say it's with the provincial or federal government. They put in data requests. data transferring agreements, and this is when they do data sharing agreements with these partners and do privacy impacts assessments. And it's just to see what, then they get a data dump, and they really get to see the data that's available, existing data that's available for them. So you can go to the next slide. So this is really what we use when we do these community sessions with, when we go in to have sessions with them. So it really begins with the health determinants at the bottom, and these cross over, as you can see. So health determinants and our identity. So they really, we first get them to define health in their own language and really analyze that word to see what health means to them and how it looks. Then we do the health status, and this is like your demographic data. So it's the vital statistics data, which we've also noticed is flawed. Because it's a sample, it doesn't capture the true numbers of the band list. And next, we do the health services and accesses. So we see what kind of partnerships the community already has, and then that's where the data sources come into play. And we look at the data that's available, and this is where we see where we need to the community needs to start collecting their own data, because these data sources don't really necessarily represent what they want to measure with their own indicators. So that's when we do the resources and supports in that whole process. And from this profile, we're able to really plan and give evidence-based decision making, because we're giving the concrete visualizations and data charts for them to plan to see if they want to collect more data on their own, to look for funding that way, and also to put more funding into programs that are actually working for them.
Thank you very much. So we have, I'm just going to go in the order that we had them on the slides, not in the order that you're sitting, just to help with the slide connection. So Carmen, would you like to give a little bit of an intro? Sure. She doesn't have slides. It's good. Yeah, I can take that.
It's all coming from in here. I'm the research manager at Chiefs of Ontario, and way back in 1997, there was a move toward moving data collection with First Nations people. And the reason why that happened was because of the Stats Canada going into our communities and collecting data. So that movement started way back in 1997 from the Assembly of First Nations. And from that point on, what happened is that our communities became more involved in I don't know if you've heard of the Regional Health Survey, and that was the beginning of that. And then from there, from the Regional Health Survey, it came out the principles of OCAP, which guided the implementation of the Regional Health Survey and guided the organizations when we collected data. Back in 2010, there was another resolution from the Assembly of First Nations to put in the First Nations Information Governance Center. So like Alberta, it's a very young organization, and all the regions are representative on that, at that center. But in Ontario, it was back in 2010 when we met David Henry, and there was a lot of information that people were talking about and using our data. And so we talked to David to enter about how do we work with you as the Institute of Clinical Evaluative Sciences. So we entered into a data governance agreement with that organization. But at the same time that was happening, we were also working from the perspective on the national level in putting in place other strategies that needed to be put forward. And so the Chiefs of Ontario is a secretariat in a coordinating body for the 133 First Nations in Ontario. We don't have a center. We are working towards that. We have a resolution to move in that direction in partnership with the Institute for Clinical Evaluative Sciences. We have many projects that we have moved on, and we also work with a strategy for patient-oriented research, where we've been granted a grant to do diabetes project in Ontario, and from that we got funding for additional person in our office. We've also worked with the province of Ontario, put in a proposal to develop our center. One of the issues that we find as an organization is that the bombardment of individuals, organizations, and outside researchers that want to work with us and to use our data. At the Institute for Clinical Evaluative Sciences, we have an agreement with Indian, or ISC, whatever they're called, to bring the data into ISIS, but we govern that data. So part of the work that we're doing is that we have a data governance committee that oversees the researchers that want to do regional projects across Ontario. I don't see my number up here, so I don't know how long I have. Across Ontario, so we now have an application where researcher can apply for the IRS data. We also are working with the FNIGC to bring over our regional health survey data and our early child education and employment data over to ISIS, building toward the future of our First Nations Research and Data Management Center. So all in all, we have a lot of work ahead of us with little amount of capacity to do it. But we are moving forward, and one of the things that we find is that we work with our community. So the data that sits in the Institute is that when communities want their data, we do not stop them. They can apply for their data. There's a process for that. And so that's a very important thing to understand. When it comes to outside researchers, though, who want to do a regional project across the province, they must come to our committee, and they must follow the application and OCAP. So just to let you know that these are things that are on the move in Ontario, and I can explain later when the other questions come up of what we're doing. So miigwech.
Thank you, Carmen. So next is Laurel, and so she has a set of slides. Please go ahead.
About the First Nations Health Authority in BC, which is a province-wide health authority. I thought I would begin by sort of situating us in terms of our health governance structure. So you see in the center of our slide there that the province of British Columbia, there are 5 regions under FNHA, which are aligned with the 5 regional health authorities of the province. And our community engagement starts there at the regional level. It has always been that way right from the genesis of the FNHA, and everything comes from regional engagements up through regional caucuses up to the FNHA. So in any case, FNHA is along the bottom. You see the service delivery hub mention that we do service delivery and planning, priority setting at a provincial level, certainly not at a regional level. Along the left-hand side is the First Nations Health Council that provides leadership and advocacy, which are primarily chiefs. And on the right-hand side is the First Nations Health Directors Association, providing advocacy, technical assistance, professional development, and they represent health directors in individual First Nations communities. The regional caucuses, one per region, which represent communities, are on the top left. You see they appoint FNHC, the First Nations Health Council, First Nations Health Authority members, and from that's where our board comes from for the First Nations Health Authority. Along the top, the Tripartite Committee on First Nations Health. So we're an integrated First Nations Health Authority in that we work closely aligned with the province and the federal government. So the tripartite committee includes our three organizations I mentioned, the regional tables, and the regional tables are executive level tables, one per region, which senior level of the health authority and of the region sit there for planning, priority setting, integration. A lot of activity happens there. And then the tripartite committee also involves Health Canada, the Ministry of Health itself, and the health authorities. So overall, we have cooperation, alignment, reciprocal accountability, so that all are working for shared goals and living up to our individual and collective commitments, so that there can be an impact on First Nations data governance, which is the topic, of course, today, and manifested through self-determination, nation rebuilding, as well as institution building. FNHA is a good example of an institution building, and all of this is a hallmark of reconciliation. This is our ecosystem of health and wellness in the province of BC for First Nations. The center, I know it's a little bit small there. Usually it's on its own slide. But that's our perspective on health and wellness with the human being, the person in the middle, surrounded by emotional, mental, physical, spiritual components, going through to relationships, responsibility, wisdom, respect. And then I think you can probably read them now. Ultimately, the environmental, cultural, economic, and social. So our vision up in the upper right is healthy, self-determining, and vibrant First Nations children, family, and communities. Our decision-making frameworks along the top, it starts at the individual, culminates all the way through community, region, sub-regions, provincial level. We have a declaration of cultural safety and cultural humility in the province that FNHA spearheaded. And it's been signed, this declaration has been signed by health authorities, by educational institutions, professional associations, regulatory bodies, Health Canada, and the Ministry of Health. There's a long roadmap on how FNHA was created, starting 2006 through many different milestones, agreements, and plans. I'm just focusing on a couple. The First Nations Health Plan 2007, which had data-related elements in it, or it has, about monitoring and reporting First Nations decision-making concerning data and health services through innovations in our governance and development of a capacity in the area of health information governance to improve access, promote meaningful research. The TDQSA, or Tripartite Data Quality and Sharing Agreement 2011, I say creation of the First Nations client file. It really existed beforehand, but it certainly was codified in this agreement. And it, similarly to Alberta, the Indian Registry was linked with demographic data from the provincial government's medical services plan, because in BC, we still pay for the health insurance for First Nations, and so they're tracked through the MSP. But the TDQSA does establish a framework for First Nations stewardship over the use of First Nations data. And eventually we will have the First Nations client file in our own possession. Right now it's at the Ministry of Health. The plans are to move it over in due time. We're just only 5 years old now. I haven't really talked about our roadmap, but we became a health authority, bona fide health authority, with transfer of funds from Health Canada in 2013, so that we assumed all service delivery functions for federally operated, federally managed funds, previously federally managed. Yes, and the TDQSA does recognize First Nations health governance and all its principles, the OCAP principles. And importantly, there's a Data and Information Sharing Committee, which adjudicates and provides ethical oversight over data access requests. And it is tripartite, but really bipartite, because it has both FNHA and Ministry of Health co-chairs. So a little bit on our priority data linkages, by us, about us, for us. The 7 core indicators have been looked at for the past 10 years on a biannual basis through data linkages, and they're pretty much deficit-based. Would be life expectancy, infant mortality, suicide, youth suicide, age standardized mortality rate. But the CEO a couple of years ago charged our organization and also the Ministry of Health to develop wellness indicators. And we have been diligently working on that, and we do have a set of 15 ones that are just being implemented right now. include things like community strength and resilience. How do you measure that? How do you measure cultural wellness? How do you measure ecological health? These are all challenges that we're meeting right now as an organization. We do have collaborative reports between the provincial health officer and our chief medical officer at FNHA has a lot of powers that are in alignment with the provincial health officer in the province of BC, but of course First Nations. And we have ongoing linkages. In BC, the opioid crisis is a state of emergency. That is a priority linkage for us. The health system matrix, I'll perhaps have an opportunity to speak about a bit more. It is provincial health utilization data, and it starts from the individual and moves up, so it is residence-based. And chronic disease registries are just a small sampling of what we do with our data linkages. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So Donna, you're up next to introduce yourself and why it's important data linkage. And she doesn't have any slides, so.
Kia ora, I don't have any slides, and I'm also from quite a different context, I think. So hopefully there's something useful in what I'm going to say. So, I mean, similar to the first presentation, Māori had our own ways of knowing and undertaking research prior to colonisation, but since colonisation we've had imposed on us external, I guess, ways of knowing about us and the data ecosystem that we currently have. And I'm talking, I guess, particularly about health. That's the area I know the best. Still really reflects those colonial state priorities around who's counted and how and what indicators are considered important to measure. In health and Māori health, though, there's been quite a long history of advocating for the need for complete and quality information for Māori communities to be really able to understand what's happening for us in health, as well as giving us the ability to monitor the Crown in terms of its action or inaction and the impact of its policies on Māori communities. So there's, even though we haven't, I guess, articulated it as a data sovereignty movement until more recent years, there's definitely been a movement around Māori rights and interests in quality data that speaks to and for Māori communities. So we've been talking about Māori data sovereignty more as a movement and a set of more coordinated activities probably for about the last 3 or 4 years, which kind of lines up with what Jennifer presented yesterday around this international movement, encouraging greater recognition of the sovereign rights that Indigenous peoples have and data about them and data from their territories. Part of the New Zealand context too, I would say, is the real growth in recognition and conversations about kaupapa Māori research, so research that's by Māori for Māori that reflects and recognises the validity of and is based in Māori ways of knowing and doing and being. And I think that's flowed through into our approach to data sovereignty as well. I'm just trying to think what's useful to say. I think there's been quite rapid uptake of technologies and data linkage approaches in New Zealand. Some of that is because we are a reasonably small country with reasonably good infrastructure and quite complete data sets, and so we've rapidly moved to a situation where data linkage is happening on a large scale. I'm not sure that most of the population would understand quite the scale at which it is happening, but a lot of what is happening, and this is my position, without sort of aligning with the rights that Jennifer talked about yesterday in UNDRIP, particularly the right to free, prior and informed consent. So while we have this really valuable and quite well used data infrastructure of linked data sets, a lot of that has happened definitely without the meaningful involvement of Māori in the establishment of any sort of governance or oversight of the research that's happening with linked data. No specific ethical requirements around sort of looking at risks and benefits for Māori community. And I would say a lot of the times data sets in there where I wouldn't think the conditions of free, prior and full informed consent have been met. So we've got this situation where there's great potential in some research happening, but we've got unanswered or unsettled, I guess, situation around Māori governance and mechanisms for actually enacting Māori sovereignty in that space. There is some so a lot of the data that we have access to for Māori communities is still really controlled by the government or government agencies. But there are Māori research organisations as well as Māori iwi, which is Māori tribes, and other sort of Māori collectives that are undertaking their own research. And there's some examples as well of good data linkage happening, and I can talk a bit more specifically about those if people are interested, where Māori organisations are putting in place data sharing agreements and protocols around data access. I think that's probably all I want to say.
Thank you, Donna. And we have Andrew's one slide. Welcome, Andrew.
Might actually go back some. Can you start at the beginning? Thank you. Thank you all for sharing your stories here. So similar to what Jen was talking about yesterday, we asked the question, what are Indigenous data? Data, information, knowledge in any format. And Billy started to get at that with the story and presentation about traditional forms of data storage with the Lakota winter counts. And for my people in Arizona, we have the saguaro cacti, which is very large. And once those die, the saguaro ribs would then be extracted and images would be documented along those. And in some cases, they would be 2 to 3 foot long or 10 to 12 foot long because those cacti can get very large. And so when we talk about Indigenous data, we're not only talking about contemporary data, which a lot of us work with day in and day out, but we're also talking about traditional forms of data storage and how our cultures have been informed. It's data about our resources, our environment, us as about individuals, but also as a collective as well. And Indigenous data sovereignty, there's the definition up top there, is about better exercising our sovereignty as tribal nations, native nations, as iwis and First Nations, but also self-government and self-determination. We're asking the questions that our communities need to know to better build capacity, to better strengthen ourselves. And so as of right now, and you kind of hear the stories from this morning, we operate now in an arena of data dependency, where we have a lot of outside entities coming into our communities and asking questions, extracting that knowledge, and then largely not returning that knowledge or reporting that back to our communities. So it really doesn't help First Nations or tribal nations develop at all. And so the ambitious move is to work back, almost backwards, towards Indigenous data sovereignty. And through that, and again, Jen discussed this a little yesterday, indigenizing data governance and through decolonizing data. And so removing the sort of status quo questions that are being asked, asking a First Nations community, what does a healthy nation look like? Building those key indicators and moving forward from there. It's also reassessing the governance structure. What do our traditional governance structures look like in the past? What are our traditional protocols that helped us move forward and develop our culture? And implementing those into an Indigenous data governance structure as well. Adding our values, Indigenous ethics back into it, and not just having these outside actors come into communities. And so this is the push that we're moving towards right now, and largely in the area that we're working in within the US. And so this is the one slide that I did want to show you, but I wanted to give you a little background information as well. And so this is the data paradigm, and it was developed with Māori researcher Dr. Tuhu Kukutai at the University of Waikato in New Zealand. Where we're at right now is sort of the gray area, is a status quo. We're starting to understand that we have data deserts that exist. In a sense, again, asking a community, what does a healthy community look like? Those indicators may not exist in data sets that are out there right now. Those may be developed right now and then move forward. And so asking these questions, you're discovering that data deserts do exist. Moving up the steps or up the pyramid, however you want to look at this, we have questions and data sets that have been developed by them, meaning identifying external by them for them. And so data about us, but not necessarily used for by us. And so then we have data sets that are by them and for us. So in this case, we can identify like the US Census, and then the American Community Survey. I'm sure there are surveys that exist up here as well that identify Indigenous people, but weren't necessarily gathered for the purpose or usage of Indigenous people. Now, if we transition into the blue gradient, we have questions that are more so by them with us. Okay, so we have partnerships and potential collaborations that are being developed from that. It can be patronizing, but this is where the tribal nations begin to have a little more input into the indicators that are being measured. And then at the top two, we have the highly aspirational bias for us and bias for them. And so we have Indigenous data sovereignty for internal uses, again, to build capacity, to exercise sovereignty, and to move our nations forward there. But also to inform the external entities as well, because there will constantly be questions coming into our communities that we can better answer as long as we have the data sets and the information to move forward there. And so as part of my job at the Native Nations Institute is part of the U.S. Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network. This is our focus area right now. Up in First Nations in Canada, they have the OCAP principles already set. As you heard, they develop and build relationships off of that. That's what we're working towards right now in the U.S., is developing these draft principles so that we can start to set the standard, inform outside researchers and in our communities as well, and then move forward from there. And so I'll be getting deeper into that with the questions that are asked later on. So if you have any other questions, please ask me after this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for all of your words and your introductions. Sure, I'll take that back. Thank you. So we had a set of questions that the panel contemplated over the past week or so and thought about what they messages they wanted to give you. One of the questions that, in a sense, we have for each other about how we do this and, you know, learning from each other about how to apply these principles in life. And you heard a lot about how these applications are happening already. But one question that, you know, I had and that we had for each other was about processes to set collective priorities for analysis that come from Indigenous communities, from the First Nation, from the iwi. So that being the first part of the question, and the second part being, how do you make decisions about access when the questions come from elsewhere? So prioritizing the questions that come from community, but then what about questions that come from elsewhere? So is there anyone else? Is there anyone who wants to take this first on the panel?
I'll do it.
Carmen, thank you.
For collective priorities, we actually went down into the communities and invited them to a forum where one of the first things I did when I came into Chiefs of Ontario, actually I was in semi-retirement, and they asked me to come back to work with the chiefs, and I said, okay, what are you looking for? So it was all about data and data collection and stuff like that. So the first thing I thought about was we need to set priorities. We need to set a First Nation health research agenda for Ontario. So we did put a health forum together, and we had communities come to the table, researchers, government, and what we did is have a symposium that identified in a broad brush about what are our research priorities for the province. It was a draft. A lot of our communities said to us that yes, this is like sort of the agenda, which was mental health, environmental impacts, and like health surveillance, and so we did that. And within there are subheadings. So these are the priorities that when we do look at questions coming from the outside and about decisions of access to data, what we do is that we have a data governance committee that is brought together to look at those questions, to look at the questions that are coming in from the outside researchers. Is it if it's a First Nation organization, like I said before, then the data that we have, which is those data sets I told you about within the Institute, we work with them to get their question answered. But with the outside researchers, one of the things that we look at is that, are you applying the OCAP principles? So the committee has put an application together, which will be posted. Our committee is very new. We will be looking at our first two applications in the fall. And what they do is to go through that application and whether or not you're answering the questions that are part of our health agenda. And so we go through that. When it comes to government, when they're asking for data, a lot of the data that they're asking for is already, some of it's already published. But if they're asking for data that's going to go down deeper into the data sets and using the IRS data, they must also come to the Data Governance Committee. It's a very structured application, and the people that sit on the committee are individuals that have background in data, that also have, our elder also uses the language to make sure that, you know, whatever's in those questions that are being asked is embedded in what we as Indigenous people or First Nations people, and it's going to uphold our sovereignty with self-government as well. So it really matters that we have a health agenda, and it really matters that the information and the data that the outside researcher wanting to look at is going to benefit our communities, and it's going to help plan and move forward also with the area of reconciliation. And I know that Michael mentioned that yesterday, or I think yesterday, about research as reconciliation. The reconciliation needs to come from the other side. It's not the First Nations that need to reconcile. It's working in partnership to make sure that we are moving forward in having our communities the data and information that they need to move forward. So a lot of times when researchers is that they want to get access to the Indian registry system. We had to look at that Indian registry system, and we had to actually look at that data and make it more applicable to the data sets that are in ISIS. And the IRS data is not all of it. We can use postal codes, we can use geography. It's not a perfect data set either, because there's things missing in it. And so we've worked with Jennifer to make sure that data was cleaned up and make sure that it has good data quality in it. So what I'm saying is that we have a process in Ontario if researchers want to work with us. And the most important thing is to build that relationship. To build a relationship with our communities so that they understand that what you are doing and what the questions they want answered can help them in the future. So I think I'll stop there. Miigwech.
Thank you, Carmen. Bonnie?
I think Chyloe really gave you a really good understanding when those priorities are set and when we sit with nations on the community profile development. But I'll talk more about Alberta-wide and when priorities come out of some of the things that communities have gone through. And so the opioid crisis was one of those examples, and our tribe, our blood tribe, declared an opioid crisis, and William was sitting on Chief and Council when that occurred, and so it was during his term that they declared the first emergency that was going on. Part of my background is nursing, and I spent about 10 years working with the Downtown East Side population group running a mobile health van, so they really tapped into a lot of that experience, and it was because we had such a great relationship with Alberta Health, and we had built those relationships that were grounded in an ethical space and in that respect, and they would work with us and to respond with the priorities. And so when the blood tribe, former Grand Chief Charles Weaselhood came to me and he said, "Bonnie, I want to know how many of our people are dying of fentanyl." And I went and sat with Larry Svensson's team in the room, and Amy had brought in Bruce McDonald, another epidemiologist, and we talked about trying to get to the root of the data, and they said, well, the problem is the medical examiner only codes it as opioid-related deaths. If we have to go into the depths of it, then we need to go in and recode. And I said, well, let's do it. And I said, I want to know everything that's going on with these people. I want to know what they were on a year before they died, a month before they died, a week before they died. And so knowing the population group, I said, I know it's complex. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be complicated, but let's get to as much of what they were doing and what was going on. And Bruce went and worked with the medical examiner, and it took over 2 years to really develop this report. That report is now available on our website, but it responded to the collective priorities and concerns in the declaration of an emergency with the opioid crisis within the Blood Tribe and other nations in Alberta. And it really helped our nations really understand how complicated this issue was. And I now understand through the epi world how expensive recoding can be. So I really want to thank Alberta Health, and I'm so grateful to that relationship. Because what I saw in the data set and what I saw in the report, or what we saw, was I think it's and I'll have to get an epi to help me understand this, but in the report it says 588% of the individuals that died of an opioid-related death were on a prescribed hydromorphone. So when that piece came out, I needed to understand prescribing practices, I needed to understand what was the pharmaceutical relationship, and so other questions came. And we're in the midst of having many scale-up conversations and other CIHR grants to really understand the depths of what is happening. We've also pulled other data to understand what is the root cause, because I know the root cause comes from traumas, comes from disconnect, comes from displacement and dispossession. And so we've done simultaneously other projects. We have quite a few large funded grants through the Canadian Partnerships Against Cancer. That was all Indigenous led. Those were Indigenous researchers that were on that team. We develop our own Indigenous logic models with our knowledge holders. We incorporate Indigenous research methodologies. We interview and conduct focus groups, all in our language, incorporating everything that we need to be able to tell those stories in a very rich context. That our Indigenous languages are very complex, and they're alive. They have spirit, so they're very descriptive. And it's through those relationships of that, of really telling the story from place. And we have partnered with Manitoba of recent and hosted the CIHR Pathways Gathering in our communities in the Blood Tribe. And that was chiefly led by William and Chyloe, and Leona's in the back room here from Manitoba, and Wendy is not with us here today, but she's in Manitoba. And our Blood Tribe knowledge holders. And so I believe there is about 5 or 6 of them. And they had a conference, a CIHR conference, where they were hostage to us, and we brought them out to our land and to our sacred sites. And I've been born and raised on the Blood Reserve, and I didn't know that there were places there that exist, so I myself learned as a Blood Tribe member. And the elders were so generous in their knowledge and their gifting of really helping people to understand why place was important, why that connection was important, and to really understand that custodian and stewardship and responsibility to care for these sacred places, and to understand how we can find solutions within these sacred spaces. And so it's through that learning. I'm really happy to report that CIHR is really working hard to ensure that the grant dollars go directly to nations because of that piece, because it has to be truly led by First Nations to find those solutions. And so a lot of this is about relationships. when researchers come to us in Alberta and ask for the data, I'm a believer in bringing it back to the nations and having the nations to understand why this could be important. And I always caution researchers, don't overpromise. If you can't change the Indian Act and you haven't been able to with all your years of research and hard work, then it's no benefit to us. So it has to be clear what you can do with it. And, but at the same time, I support a really good research project that allows space for our worldview to be part of it from the beginning, right down to the analysis, the telling the story, and the dissemination and the knowledge transfer. We don't go into research relationships in hopes of publications and hope somebody reads it to change policy and legislation. We only do it if we know that that's what it's going to influence that change. And we will work really hard to make sure that that's really clear. And in all levels of the relationship, the data sharing agreement isn't just with the funder and then with the First Nations, but it's also with the individuals that are coding. And I've gotten so far with a researcher, they were right there from the beginning. And when it came time to code the data and transfer the raw data set to have them do the coding, the university wouldn't allow them to sign the non-disclosure agreement, so we lost her. And that was painful, but it was a really hard lesson because we wouldn't bend. And so when I really sit with university institutions and they tell me we're following the Tri-Council Policy Statement Chapter 9, we're implementing OCAP, we're doing this, I said, no, you're not, because your policies aren't allowing you to sign these things. And so you're not being respectful. And I will walk away. I'll walk away for $250,000, I don't care. If it's not respectful and it's not doing what it's going to do, then we won't engage. And those are those strong positions. And it's not to, I'm a believer in relationship building. You can ask Larry. We've had some really hard roads and hills to climb, and we've made some great inroads. But I'm a believer that everybody comes in to trying to help with a good heart. And I'm trying to support that. And trying to ensure that harms don't come to not only the people, but to you as researchers and government individuals, because it really, really does impact the integrity of you as researchers, that I want to mitigate those harms. So that's how we function. Thank you.
Thank you. So Bonnie answered all of the questions that we have. Thank you for sharing all of that. So I'm going to move to the next question. Sorry, I went back too far. So one of the questions that I often get from people is about how, when we're working with provincial level data and we're trying to do regional reports for First Nations regions, how do we make sure that communities are informed and involved in using the data, building that capacity for that to happen in a meaningful way, and sharing information that is also helpful and useful in ways that are accessible. So I just, if there's someone who wants to, yeah, Laurel, go ahead.
Yeah, so at the FNHA,
Sorry,
I forgot to do this. At the FNHA, I spoke a little bit about our regional engagement processes, and of course, those are two-way. The regions, the communities feed priorities up to our regional health and wellness plans, and we also have Gathering Wisdom every 18 months, which is a large conference that brings in communities. So there's a two-way dialogue. But what happens when we have a report, for example, there's no variation from this. Communities are informed first about it. And that can happen through a variety of ways. But generally, and our partners will know this. So if it's cancer data or if it's opioid, even the opioid crisis data, as urgent as it was to get First Nations specific results out, we respected our own engagement processes first and had webinars with the First Nations Health Council, with the First Nations Health Directors Association. We had webinars so that other chiefs and health directors could join in, or community members or whoever, and that happened first. And then afterwards, the public release can occur, and typically it'll be joined if it's involving the provincial health officer. The provincial health officer and our chief medical officer will jointly present these results, be it in a press conference or whatever forum that it may take. We do sub-regional reporting as well, and by sub-regional I mean generally at an aggregate nation level, First Nations level. I'm going to use the health system matrix as an example. It is an aggregate database from the Ministry of Health, primarily hospital and physician utilization information or data, but it also includes home and community care, residential care, prescriptions as well as that too. It's really good because the ministry has spent a lot of time developing a way of looking at data from a population perspective. So there's population groups in there and different service lines, and which really assist in its interpretation. But what we've done for communities is that we've translated this into dashboards. And for Interior Region, which was the pilot for this, we've been able to provide dashboards to the regional offices so that the region itself can go in and pull out information. These are Tableau dashboards. It doesn't have to be that technology. And if they want to look at physician utilization or GP attachment, or use of the hospitalization, average length of stay, all these typical utilization indicators they can access themselves at the nation level and so now we have a province-wide data linkage following that pilot, and we'll be at the process right now. We've issued reports. Reports go to the regions first. The regions can share them with the health authorities if they want to, and further from that, but I don't let anything go out of my office that doesn't go to the regional folks first. And that the plans are that there will be similar methodology in the other regions so that they can access their own data themselves electronically through dashboards. Thanks.
Thank you. That's a wonderful example. Chyloe.
So yeah, I was just going to talk more about the community profiles work that I'm doing. So when so communities actually get their own data. We have nothing to do with housing any type of data. They get their own data dumps. And then we set up a community session with them. And we literally have a list of their priorities that they established with possible data sources that we can use. And I have to go with them priority through data source by data source to get them to look at the raw data sets and ask them, what do you want to show? How do you want this to be shown? Do you want a graph, a chart? And literally they will help me talk right down to the caption of what they want on the figure of that process, just to showcase so they can understand what they're talking about when they go and negotiate for funds for any type of, or policy change. And this will go back and forth for as long as they want, or until they're satisfied with what the report will show. And then the report goes directly to the communities, and the community uses it in any way that they want to. One of our communities actually used the report, and they're now getting a health center or a hospital.
Thank you. Carmen, you want to share?
I just want to take a different view on sharing information. One of the things that happens, and it's very important that we give our, the reports back to the communities. We have an individual in our office that is our knowledge advisor, and when we do reports, we try to do a people's report that goes back to the communities. And now with the research that's going on, we ask our researchers now that are working with us to give us a communication plan on how you're going to get this work back to the communities. We will work with you to make sure the language that are going out into, that the reports going back into the communities, that they can understand. But one of the issues with sharing, there's not a problem with sharing the information. It's very important that our communities get it. But part of the issue, particularly in Ontario, there is no, the resources are not there to go back to our communities and to actually do the proper going back and explaining to them the reports. And I think that's a big issue that we're not really addressing. And we all have, like in Ontario, we would love to do that, to go back to the communities, particularly if you have the regional health survey. One of the things that they give a lot of money to is to collect the data. But if you even look at the Tri-Council guidelines, it says you should go back to the communities to see if you've got the information, did you capture the information correctly? They need to sit with you and say to you, no, I don't think you did. So that's the piece that's missing, particularly in Ontario, where we believe that the proper way of doing it is to take those reports and go back into the communities and actually tell them this is what we found out. But there's a big gap there in doing that because we're not yet there in the funding that we have to go back to the communities. I believe in it. I've put processes in place so that we can do that, like using the internet as our as one of them. But communities need to know first if they can, if it's there. Secondly, what we've done, we have a health forum every year where we present the information back to the communities, and we usually have like maybe about 150 communities representative that come, not 150, but 90 to 80. We have 133 First Nations in Ontario. We're very spread out. So the sharing of information, you have to come up with some very creative ways. And so the proper way of doing it also, and I think Manitoba and Alberta is probably doing a really good job because they do get the funding for it, is actually sitting down with communities and explaining to them what the data means and what the reports say. That we don't have. So there is big gaps in different provinces on how we share that information. And we have a process as well, is that when researchers, even the regional health survey that we do ourselves, needs to go back to the organizations to make sure that it's they know what's going on. And then we also go to our Chiefs Committee on Health, which is our leadership, to say, this is what the report says, so that they're not blindsided if a reporter comes and says to them, you know, what is this all about? I didn't know this. And one of the things that did happen is that the coroner released data on suicides. We didn't know. And so I had to talk to the coroner's office and say, if you are going to do something like that, that is your role. But please inform us so that we can take the questions and answer them. And we couldn't answer them because we didn't have their data. So now we're building a relationship with the coroner's office so that we can actually work on a project so that we can look at opioid use and suicides. But you can't have a government agency releasing First Nations data, or they actually called it First Nations data, but they didn't know it was if it's Indigenous or Aboriginal or Métis, or they put it all together as one. And who gets the calls is the Chiefs of Ontario and our leadership, and they were blindsided. So it's very important to have that going back to the communities, but also informing those government agencies, if you are going to do something like that, please inform us, because we get blindsided. So that's all I wanted to say about that. Thank you. Miigwech.
Thank you, Carmen.
I have a really good story in a very stressful story, and it relates back to the opioid crisis again. So again, the Blood Tribe declared their second emergency of February this year. This time, the chief had asked me and another individual that's a researcher from my home community to come and meet with him the night before. And we spent a long time talking about what they've been doing and all the harm reduction work that they've been doing since 2013. When they declared their first crisis, I believe Billy said it was over 70 people that they buried that year for opioid-related death. And it was very traumatizing because it was almost weekly, every bi-weekly they were going through another burial. And all the work that they've done getting Suboxone clinics in the community directly delivered by one of our member doctors, and really trying to build the support and capacity around that, because when you do stuff like that, we have roughly over 300 individuals on Suboxone. And a lot of other things come into play. We did all the testing. All of a sudden, there's a spike in Hep C. We had to get them to the treatment, and so everything is just going. And it's like this, real crisis that you're in a continuum with. But the good news story is in February, when the chief had declared an emergency, he knew that there was quite a high number of individuals that showed up in the emergency department for an opioid-related overdose. And so we met as a community. He brought everybody together who had been working and doing their due diligence on harm reduction. And I was sitting beside my cousin, Dr. Tailfeathers, and I said, what do you need? What do you guys need right now from as far as data? What would be helpful? And she said, well, would you be able to get us the opioid-related overdoses that showed up in the emergency department? So I asked the chief if that's what he wanted me to do the request. I then contacted Larry's office. That was given to us within about an hour of asking. And so the chief had that data right in front of him. And when we looked at the amount of individuals, it was like 78 plus that showed up that weekend with overdoses because carfentanil hit the Lethbridge area. And we had 2 confirmed deaths. Now in 2013, to have 70 plus confirmed deaths of opioids, all that harm reduction work that they'd been doing saved lives. Because we knew that we had a very high number come in and present with overdoses, but the community had done its due diligence to save lives, and we lost 2. So the second declaration of emergency just showed all of the work that they'd been doing has been very, very helpful to them as a community to really address this crisis. And the getting the data to them, directly to them, without any kind of interference with a third party or trying to, was extremely helpful. And that was February, and I'm very happy to report Billy and I and Dr. Rita Henderson from the University of Calgary supported the Blood Tribe in their first application grant submission to the CIHR to really evaluate what they've been doing. So really hoping that we can continue to support them, to do the good work that they're doing, and to really help others understand how they can have some hope at the end of this very bleak addiction. And one of the other things that I'm extremely happy to report, we're on a CIHR grant for looking at racism in the ED department. And most of the times I'm hitting chief and council chambers and trying to convince them this is a good idea, trying to get participation. And I'm really nervous that we don't have enough dollars to fund all of the nations that want to be participating on this. And this came with the opioid-related work that we're doing also with the University of Calgary. We have a small grant where we're looking at it. And for the first time ever, I had a community call us begging to be part of this research grant. That's never happened. Never happened. And so you can see that they're really seeing some positives and some hope that they can have ways that if they have a respectful team and they have a team that allows for that space for them to tell that story, that it can help them in what they're doing to try and help their people. So just some good stories about the sharing. Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to make sure, Andrew, I want to make sure that the panelists who haven't had a chance to respond have a chance, and then I want to make sure we have time for people to ask their own questions. So, Andrew and Donna, this is this is your time. So, Andrew, you look like you're ready to talk, but just answer any of the questions, anything that is left in your heart, and then we'll.
I also have a story, and it can kind of go back to the last question of like who sets priorities for the questions that are asked. An example I'd like to share here is of the Gold King mine spill that happened in Arizona on the Navajo Nation a couple of years ago. There was an EPA large machine operator that was working in the area that was basically moving earth in front of the barrier that was holding back the mining waste. Dug too far, completely just erupted. The mining waste just dumped into the river close by, turned the entire river yellow for weeks. And out of that, you ask the question, who sets the priorities then? Well, the EPA was directly involved with that, and so obviously they had a stake in that game there. But so did the Navajo Nation, the communities that lived along that riverbed. And so, as it developed and went on, the EPA did its report, and it found like maybe there's 1 or 2 indicators of long-term impacts of this mine spill. And they kind of identified a hiker that would go by and drop their water bottle or cup in the river that might be, short-term exposure once, maybe twice, that's it. Well, there is a Navajo hydrologist at the University of Arizona, Dr. Coletta Chief, incredible woman, incredible researcher, spoke with her nation, spoke with the president and vice president of the Navajo Nation, got involved with the local communities there, managed to get researchers from not only the University of Arizona, Arizona State University, and Northern Arizona University, and including the tribal college, got undergraduate students involved, the communities involved, and started asking questions, developing these key indicators at this point. So from that, they asked questions along the community that lived along the river. That 1 or 2, indicator of impact that the EPA set as their report was then quadrupled. Like they found over 40 different indicators of exposure risks along the river there. There was a representative from Arizona that I was watching the news report and basically was asked a question like, what do you think the impact of this is? Like, well, dilution is the solution to pollution, and just kind of brushed it off at that point. I was like, this is ridiculous. But as far as getting community informed and involved, this is a very horrible situation, a very reactionary situation, but it's incredible to see that this network come together of not only Indigenous researchers, but non-Indigenous researchers at different institutions, and also involving the tribal community as well. And so as those survey questions were answered, that information was then communicated back to the community there along the river as well in the nation. And so if you look it up online, you may be able to find some of that information, but it was through outreach sessions, both in English and traditional Navajo language, so that the elders could understand, because there are some that don't even speak English, and which is really important. So outside researchers might not be able to do that, but getting these students involved, communicating this information back at the ground level, and sharing that information with the community was incredibly important at that point. And again, going back to, it's not necessarily for publication. It's for the protection of the community, and for the survival of the community in this case, because livestock's impacted, drinking water is impacted. Ceremonial practices can be impacted by the mining waste that kind of just settles there. Well, what if that clay at the bottom of that river is used for a ceremony? Can you continue to use that clay for that ceremony going on, or is it done? Do you have to go somewhere else? Can you go somewhere else? Are questions that need to be asked. So that's a story that I like to share and kind of answers the last 2 questions there.
Thank you. Donna.
Kia ora. I'm feeling nervous going last because I'm always the one who tends to be really negative and dystopian. So apologies. I guess I was just thinking more about the last question around what non-Indigenous organisations and researchers can do to move with Indigenous data sovereignty, or at least move the rocks out of the way, drawing on Jennifer's words yesterday. And I'm thinking, because where I'm based in a university, thinking about our context as university-based researchers, particularly in a sort of neoliberal university, a lot of the ways our universities are set up, they value types of outputs and types of ways of working that actually are in conflict often, or put more rocks in the river. So I'm really going to work that metaphor. In the river for actually being able to operationalise Indigenous data sovereignty. But I think that's also a space where we can have a role in pushing back and resisting. I mean, this work is going to be disruptive because we're trying to disrupt status quos about what is considered a good research relationship, what is considered a valuable output. So what the others were talking about, of the need to have sort of long-term, ongoing, meaningful, deep relationships is not something that is usually funded in our grants in universities, or even valued in our sort of recognition at academic promotion type processes. So I think, but we can, in those spaces, push back against that in little ways if we really want to work in ways that advance Indigenous sovereignty. We do actually have to start pushing back against the sort of what's valued in research, because I think we know that, you know, publication, particularly behind a paywall in a high-impact journal, is not the best way to get the data back to communities, but it is what our university will value. They value peer review from people who are often not my peers, but they don't value the peer review that you get when you actually have to stand on your marae or stand at home and talk to people about the research. And that's a much more robust, sometimes frightening, but very necessary peer review that's not valued. So I guess that's thinking practically about what we can do when we're based within non-Indigenous organisations to be part of that disruption, to create better water flows, and to allow us to operationalise some of those really important ways of working, so that we can minimise the harm that research has done to Indigenous communities and be part of research that furthers self-determination. So, kia ora.
Thank you. Okay, so we wanted to, we're actually on time if we just leave out 3-4 of the questions that we originally planned to ask. So we wanted to have leave this last half hour, though, for your questions and conversation with you about what you want to know from the panel. So we're opening it up now for questions, and we've got some in our back pocket if you don't have any. Can you come to a microphone so everyone can hear you? There is one there and one there. Thank you.
Stuart Kinner from University of Melbourne in Australia. Thanks to all the panellists for your presentations. It was really helpful. So I guess what I'm interested in as a non-Indigenous researcher, some guidance from the panel on the kind of work that I do. So my research looks at the health of people who have contact with the criminal justice system in Australia. When we're talking about prisons, Indigenous people are overrepresented by a factor of 13, and in youth justice by a factor of 25. So when we think about the health of those populations, we need to think a lot about the health of Indigenous Australians. Having said that, in prisons, 3/4 of people are non-Indigenous, and in youth justice, half of the people in detention are non-Indigenous. So we can't think exclusively about that. And so as a researcher who's quite new to this and trying to learn more about Indigenous data sovereignty, how can you help people like me to navigate that difficult situation where I want to understand and respect all of the principles that are being articulated here, but in the same way, my sampling frame, maybe it is an issue of sampling frame. I'm not doing Indigenous health research. I'm doing research on the health of people who experience incarceration. But necessarily, I must learn about this stuff and apply these principles, but I'm not quite sure how to do it.
I'll take a stab at it. First of all, it's really knowing the population group that you're trying to work together with. In Canada, they actually don't identify us properly in the prison system. They lump us all together as Aboriginal. And so you have 4 distinct groups, I guess you would say 5. If you do the First Nation status, non-status, the Inuit, the Métis, and I guess those that have lost that connection of identity, right, because of the 60s scoop and the loss of identity through child welfare or adoption out. So really getting to know that population group and how they identify, I think, is really key and important. But one of the things that I'm really trying to help others understand, and it's interesting that you come and ask, because I'm missing the kickoff of looking at the Policing Act reform for legislation. And it's when I look at the population group, it's always looking at what was their life story, where did they come from, and when did the disconnect happen to have them end up in the system. And the other thing that we need to really consider is the brain injuries that a lot of them are have been living with and being misunderstood or misdiagnosed or missed completely. Things like FAE, FAS, ADHD, like all of these labels that they go through. And the traumas that they've had in childhood, you know. When I've worked with these population groups, a lot of them have survived severe adverse childhood events like sexual abuse, sexual exploitation, neglect, and just the simplicity of not ever having anybody love them in their life. And so, and then you get to the other areas, and so the system of ending up in the system of institutionalization like a prison is an outcome of those unresolved traumas and that pathway that they should have been put on instead of shuffled from one foster home to another until they just fell apart in the system, or reconnecting them back to their community people and getting strength in their identity and connection, and really understanding the extent of their brain injuries, right, of what they can comprehend. I supported my father when he was a court worker representing First Nations in the court system. And he came to me one day, and I was busy nursing in the Blood Tribe, and he was so frustrated he was fighting with the Crown prosecutor. And I said, well, what's going on? Just talk to me. And he said, well, this guy, he's FAS, and he's trying to make friends with, the street people, and so the street people told him, go steal hairspray. Well, he went into the drugstore in the local mall, and he stole moose. And he came back to the street people, they're mad at him, so they made him go back, so the crazy guy goes back in, and this is his brain injury, right? And he exchanges it for hairspray, but he gets caught. And part of his conditioning sentence in his probation was he could never re-enter the mall again. And because he didn't understand or comprehend cognitively what never was, he continued to violate and breach that probation until he was faced with maybe incarceration now. And I just turned and looked at my dad and I said, well, first get him a really good diagnosis of understanding the extent of his brain injury. And then now countersue the Crown and tell them they're harassing somebody with a mental illness and somebody who has an injury that can't comprehend cognitively what those conditions are. And so they backed off completely, dropped all of those conditions. But it took really understanding those individuals and how misunderstood they were in the system and how caught they were in the system. And then when you look at the population group, and if we really studied the population group, so I'm grateful that you're doing that work. And whatever you can need to get support, I'm here for you. So I'm guessing there's a good majority that are misunderstood. So we do need to support them, because guess what? They come home, and they're going to come home to us. And if they're going to come home more damaged and more injured because of the surviving those institutions, then we need to be ready, because it's painful for them to reconnect, and it's even more painful for them to attempt to reconnect to us as a people, and we reject them. It's one more trauma that they have to live through. And so we have to really try and work together to ensure that those traumas are minimized and that the reconnection is not as painful. Thank you.
Thank you, Bonnie.
Could I just say something quickly too? I'm thinking particularly from the point of view of administrative or potentially linked data that might be being used to look at these issues. So in New Zealand, Māori make up 53% of the male prison population and 63% of the female prison population. So it's a real issue for us. So I think in terms of the use of administrative data, two of the things that I think are really important to keep in mind and think about how you might account for in any sort of quantitative analysis is the fact that you're dealing with a racialised and racist data set. So speaking from New Zealand, and I'm sure there's continuities for Indigenous peoples across the world, we know that Māori over-surveilled, they're over-surveilled by the police, they're overcharged, they're much more likely to come into contact with the court system. Come into contact sounds very passive, to be targeted by the police and be pushed into corrections. So they're going to be in the data set in ways that are already, you're dealing with a very biased data set, so you have to think about what that means for the analysis that you're doing in terms of where it might push or look like things are happening that are actually just a result of the over-surveillance of Indigenous bodies in our nations. And I think the other thing to think about in this, for us it's a real risk in New Zealand because our corrections department have said that they want to actuarial risk model the entire population. And then use those risk models to predict risk of reoffending in the future. So if we know that our people, most of the data is about Māori people, we know that irrespective of whether or not they include Māori in the risk profile, it's begun to become a predictor of risk. Then they're saying that they want to use it in frontline decision making in the future. So it's basically building the racism into the actual real risk model and then creating an algorithmic racial profiling rather than a manual one. So, sorry, I was going to say something very facetious there, but I'll just stop. I think the other point to think about when you're looking at administrative data is there's some really useful stuff that we can do, but in addition to it not measuring outcomes that are of priority to Indigenous community, it also doesn't measure variables that actually get at the process by which being Indigenous becomes a risk. So in those data sets we have, like Māori ethnicity is collected, albeit quite dodgy processes and corrections, but it's not being Māori per se that's the risk. The risk is from the hostile environment toward Māori people, but we don't measure racism, we don't measure over-policing. So what am I trying to say? So I guess it's really, there's ways that you can improve some of the research by being really critical about the variables that you're using and what is, where Indigenous status is just marking risk for exposure to racism, which is a variable that we don't measure in our government data sets. So does that make clear? Oh, make sense? Because otherwise I think what happens is it becomes seen as that's the predictor of risk rather than racism as the predictor of risk. So those are sort of some technical, practical things that you can think about with the use of the data that can lead us hopefully away. And just because I'm just putting in a plug for the solution is really to get rid of prisons. They're not, for me, as Māori, we never had them, we don't need them. There are better ways. So kia ora.
Thank you.
Just wanted to quickly contribute. We, on the Blood Tribe, we have a restorative justice program called the Kainai Peacemaking Program. And I worked in the court systems for about 4 years when I was there. And I kind of have a stance on quantitative research when it comes to human beings. Sometimes that doesn't tell the whole story. You know, that's my stance. Sometimes it doesn't tell the whole story, and when you're doing that kind of research, oftentimes I feel that the story needs to be heard to be fully understood of an individual, especially a collective group like the First Nations been through some tough things historically, and there's historical trauma there. And I think that a lot of times the qualitative stuff extracts data that you can see over a group of people, but doesn't catch those individual stories. So I just wanted to share that.
I think, like in sort of a summary, I think definitely to be able to tell those stories, because you know that the stories of Indigenous people are within the data, then that requires the involvement of Indigenous people. Michael.
So first of all, thanks to all of the panelists and Jennifer for a terrific panel. It's been hugely informative for me. I just wanted to actually just make one comment in picking up the point that was last made around the biases that are inherent in data and how that gets reflected in some of the work. I think that risk is actually increasing with the advent of things like AI, and where the algorithms are often very difficult to understand, and the biases inherent in the data of all sorts, racism being one of them, may also be poorly understood. So I think it's something all of us have to be aware of as these techniques are used more and more. But I want to pick up on a point, I think it was Chyloe, have I got your name correct? Sorry, no, Bonnie would be, yes.
Chyloe.
Chyloe, sorry, Chyloe. You made a point about feeding data, feeding reports and information back to communities and nations, and how you do that in partnership, where the communities are basically working with you for how data is presented and how it's described and so on. I think that's fascinating. I just wanted to ask, is that the same when you're working with a researcher, let's say, and it's a question that's being driven in partnership, but it's emanating from the research initially. Is that also happening in Alberta, where the researchers are working with the communities on how the data should be interpreted and presented and so on?
Yeah, it's happening both ways. So I was actually involved in HPV vaccination project. It's called Envina, Enhancing Alberta. It's a long acronym. And so what we did is we had a gathering about 2 years ago, June last year, and we took the we had focus groups, and we asked about the barriers and supports that the community members thought they had against the HPV uptake within their communities, and they were driven by the U of C questions. And so then we went back to the manuscript, and me and one of the analysts at the U of C were coding through in vivo, so we're doing like the qualitative analysis, and we found that, I found that I actually had to kind of have that open dialogue with her on how to interpret First Nations perspectives from an Indigenous point of view. There was a lot of, it needed to be more contextualized, where she was just pulling out like singular themes. And so that conversation and dialogue, it's teaching, we're teaching communities how to use data, we're teaching researchers how to ask questions that makes their data sets more meaningful and how to extract and analyze that data more positively.
I just have one more thing to add. The publication that she's talking about is actually published in a journal if you wanted access to it. I think Chyloe would be happy to share it with you. I've been nursing for almost 30 years, had to read publications in journals, medical journals, and I hate to say this because I really do love research, but sometimes they're painful, especially when I have to read about hand washing and technique and why you have to do it a certain way. But and so after I read this article, and what I noticed between the Indigenous analyst and the non-Indigenous analyst is they definitely go for the deficit first, and the Indigenous analyst looks naturally at resilience. And so when I read the article, I was really grateful to Chyloe for her portion of really fighting for their voice, because I could hear the elders talking in that journal article, and that's a never in a medical journal article, especially around something like a vaccination, right? So when those things happen and it gets published, those are real, I guess, things that you want to enhance, and you want to make sure that you leave space for that, or that you allow space for that, for the two worldviews to work together, not to one dominate over the other, because the contextualization of understanding the barriers and challenges was really well thought, I guess, the information was shared so freely by the elders and knowledge holders. But to have the Indigenous analyst capture it, but work together collaboratively with the non-Indigenous analyst, I think was really a great win for us. And I think it challenged us, but it also helped us strengthen how we do things moving forward.
Thank you. That's an amazing example. Thank you. David, I think, okay. Go ahead.
Hello, thank you so much for your contribution today and yesterday. I certainly benefited a lot from this. My name is Mahib Zarjamehri. I work with the province of British Columbia, Canada, as an economist with Ministry of Education, where I almost see on a daily basis data about students in the kindergarten to grade 12 education system. And given we have roughly about 70,000 Aboriginal students in our system, some of that data pertains to Aboriginal students. I really like the concepts that you, particularly Andrew, shared with data by Aboriginal people for Aboriginal people. I'm just wondering, where does comparability sit within the frameworks and paradigms you're discussing? Is that an Aboriginal theme? Would that be contemplated? Am I even on the right track thinking about it? Because as it stands, provincially and nationally, when we report data, Aboriginal population is separated out from the rest of the country. So are other cohorts, for instance, immigrant population, English language learners, students with special needs. How does that look to you all from the perspective of Aboriginal data sovereignty and the decolonization? How do you see it? And is the comparability even there? Would it be beneficial? So I just want to get your comments on that.
I can maybe ask, I think when I started this work about 15 years ago, I had a really intense, heated conversation with a federal government employee. And we talked about comparability. So I guess the question would be, who is comparability important to? And when you work with First Nations and you understand historically on how they think and how they address the issues that are impacting them in the world, comparability is not something that they do, because they approach everything through the collective. And there's an elder's teaching that says we never walk too far ahead in the path and leaving people behind, right? But with saying that too, when I was working with Alberta Health, and you can see it on our health trends, we actually did do comparability. So the comparability was really to wake up Canada, wake up Alberta, and to really showcase, almost in a public shaming sort of way, where First Nations life expectancy was. And we did do comparability, and we overlapped it with the World Health Organization data. And so when you see First Nations in Alberta having the same life expectancy as individuals in Paraguay, Guatemala, and Cambodia, and non-First Nations in Alberta having life expectancy as individuals in Sweden, Australia, and Singapore, and that gap is significant. And then the question is why is that gap where it's at for the richest province in this country? And so it's their question now, and they have to answer that question. And it's not as simple as saying First Nations make bad choices and that's why we die sooner, right? It's a more complicated story. So comparability is, you would need to be cautious. And if you have a First Nations research partner, or, and if that's important to them, then it would have to be guided by them and understood as to why they wanted to do it. There is when it comes to education, I don't mean to put anybody on the spot, but I was living in Vancouver, and my daughter was going to school with the Musqueam Nation members in this local school by UBC and the other very wealthy kids in that Shaughnessy area. And and I have a child that is extremely brilliant and exceeds in Western school, right, academically. And I remember when I was, and we lived in the Musqueam Nation, and my sisters are married there, so we have family there. But I remember being really busy nursing there, and the teacher tells me, "Oh, I don't need to see you at parent-teacher interview because your daughter's doing much better than the Musqueam kids. It's probably because she's Blackfoot." And I said, "Whoa, wait a minute. Now I need to see you." And so comparability in that context was a big no-no. And so I had to do some really heavy teaching, you know. This person that excels, you know, was nurtured since, you know, could have been everything, right? But, and loved and cherished, right? And guided and supported and had that richness, you know, of that support, and was allowed to achieve silently without pulling them out to say, you know what, you know, they're brilliant, right? And we would just all kind of know that something incredible was going to come out of this individual's mouth, but she just very quiet and shy and humble, and a lot of natural humility, because this child was also raised in ceremony. And that's what I had to teach the Western system, because they really like to push out those that are really high achievers in their systems, right? And I said, don't. You let her silently achieve. And so with all of that thinking, I think that's important to understand.
Thank you. So
I just got one comment.
Laurel wanted to say something, and then Carmen, and then we have one more question and 5 minutes.
Okay.
Context.
I'll be
Okay,
quick.
good.
Okay. Comparability is unfortunate because it's usually deficit-based, but it is a reality. And the reason I say that is, I'll give you an example. In one of our regions, there was money being expended on new treatment beds for primarily substance use issues. And the health authority was willing to provide, I think, 3 beds allocated for First Nations needs. And we were able to access data, deficit-based data, that showed how much higher substance use utilization was by First Nations in the provincial health system. And we upped that to 15 beds. So, and that's just one example in BC, how we've been able to leverage resources, unfortunately, from a deficit base. But it's, from the other end of the coin, when I have to issue a report that has closing the gap or deficit-based indicators, I always preface it by a section about wellness and about the history of colonization and dispossession of land and racism and all that have contributed to where we are right now. And also make the statement that this is not blaming the victim. This is the performance, could be the performance of the health system. This is the performance of the state that we're measuring, not a reflection back on the person. And I guess the last thing I'd like to say is that I really believe that whenever data is identified from a linkage as First Nations, it becomes First Nations data. And so that you should, and you can contact me afterwards or come and we can seek out an Aboriginal partner for you that might help you present the data in a culturally safe paradigm or a culturally safe way, and make sure that you respect that these principles that we've talked about today. Okay, thanks.
I just have one comment. One of the things about comparability is I agree with my colleagues, but there's some things that you ask our people that really bothers me in the education area, and that is when you say low literacy. We may have low literacy in the area of English, but we're not low literate in our own language. And I think that's the difference. So that has to change, because if we speak in our own language and we speak from the heart, that's different than speaking English. So when it comes to that comparable, like the low literacy, I think that those types of terms have to change as well. So that's just one thing I'd like to say. Thank you.
Thank you. And Andrew, do you?
I had to defer to Bonnie and Laurel and Carmen there on that question, definitely. In the U.S., as a different example, we have, these deficits that are there. We have the Bureau of Indian Education that handles some of the schools on the reservations. They're falling apart. And so you want to talk about how reforming in school, well, we need to get these buildings up and running before we can even get to have that conversation. And I think they kind of answered the comparative portion of that as well.
Thank you. I just want to take a moment to thank these panelists for sharing so much of their experiences, the stories, the challenges, the successes, the resilience. I'm really inspired by all of you and have learned a lot from this session. Thank you for your questions, and I think we'll have ongoing dialogue about these things. So just want to heartfelt thank you again.